Good evening, or good morning, and welcome to week 2 of Foundations of Worship and Preaching, hybrid. And we are talking today about, or this week, we're working on pages 3 and 4 of your sermon. Before we get to that, great work you're doing really, really good work on pages 1 and 2. You are looking at your texts really well. You are finding the places where you're stuck. You're finding great themes, or each of you is finding a really good theme. You're still working on that. Some of you're finding good sort of guidelines or outlines for those pages 1, 2, 3, and 4. I love how you're working with each other and helping each other. What you're doing actually is a thing in preaching. It's called collaborative preaching, and it's the image of a preacher working all alone by themselves in their office with their Bible and their computer and working all by themselves. This is a problem. It works for some people. I think it works better if we have some kind of collaborator, whether it's 2 or 3 or one person. Maybe it's your spouse, your friend, your colleague, or even some random people that you get together with to help you with your sermon. This is good. We're doing this, and this is actually good practice. It's a good practice to keep generally. One more thing before I go into pages 3 and 4, and that is the tiny dog now is mine. I'm glad that you're looking at that. Don't try to do it all this time. The tiny dog is now mine is really it's kind of an editorial thing in a way. Some of it is anyways. Let's just say that for now we're working really hard on preaching one text and having one good theme for that text. So we've got the tiny, and let's just say that the rest of it, dog now is mine. If you find the image, that's great. If you find the mission, that's great. If you find the doctrine, that's great. We're going to talk about this when we get together after we hear your sermons. You may find that you have a great, strong doctrine there and didn't know it. You may find that you had a great image there and weren't really consciously working on it. These are just things to keep noticing as we go. So just concentrate for now on one text and one theme, and we'll leave the rest for later. So grace in the text is page 3, and grace in the world is page 4, and you know already how this goes. So again, with this sermon, we're looking at an 8 to 10 minute sermon, and I'd like as much as you can to keep these pages equal in duration. So you have 2.5 minutes or so to do grace in the text, and 2.5 minutes to do grace in the world. So you want to stay in the text for page 3, you want to stay in the world for page 4. What we're talking about here in pages 3 and 4 is the gospel. The gospel is a thing. It is the central idea, the kerygma of the New Testament and the Old Testament. God is bringing good news to all of us. In the context of Israel, God is bringing good news for Israel in various ways at various times, sometimes in mundane ways, sometimes miraculously. As Christians, we believe that the cross and resurrection and Jesus' life and actions and miracles is the good news, or it gives us a glimpse into the good news that God wants to bring and is bringing into the world. So there's a pattern to the Christian gospel, and that is it is the pattern of moving from, it's not quite bad to good, because that's a bit of a cheapening of the whole thing. It's more nuanced than that. It is the cross to the resurrection. It is slavery to liberation. It is sickness to health. It is loneliness to community, right? Or that kind of thing. So it is this move from something that is dragging us down to something that's lifting us up, right? It's a move toward community. It's a move toward love, right? Now, the thing about this is that it's not uncomplicated, which is to say positively, it's complicated. The good news is not always nice news, right? I think we found that in some of these texts, right? The good news in Suzanne's text, Jesus brings the good news and is the good news, and then the people of his own hometown, no less, go to murder him. Whoa. So the good news in some people, and we've seen this in other texts too, when Jesus heals somebody, there's a whole bunch of people who get angry about it, right? In the Magnificat, Mary sings about how God will liberate the poor, lift up the poor, and send the rich away empty. Whoa. So we have this kind of, it's not easy. The gospel brings great news, but often it's not an easy kind of news for everybody to hear, right? It includes some and perhaps not others. This is radical. And this is we're not simply going from bad to good. We're going from a place of sin and wounds to a place of forgiveness and healing. It doesn't solve everything. It's not a nice little package that you can wrap up and give to somebody. It's more complicated than that. And we get to spend a whole lifetime as Christians trying to figure out what grace actually means and how beautiful it is and how complicated it is. Nonetheless, in our sermon, we're moving from the trouble to the grace. So you can see where this pattern of this sermon particularly comes from. So grace in the text, well, it's there, and you found it already, most of you. Jesus is going about healing. He's going about inviting people. He's going about his work, and God is doing amazing things. So unpack that for us. Tell us more about that. What does this woman's life look like, perhaps, after she's been healed? How does this change the community? How does this change her? In the case of Suzanne's text, you have to go back with that one, right? Where's the good news in the text? Well, it's actually in the sermon that Jesus preached and the fact that he got out alive. But in some texts, it's harder to find than others, right? And Paul Wilson has some notes about how you can think about that. So that's the good news. The grace in the text is not, in my experience as a teacher of preaching and as a preacher, we can often find the good news in the text. That's not a big problem. It's the grace or the gospel in the world that is tough. And here you have to probably venture a risk to make an analogy to, you can see that God is working here in your text in this particular way. What's an analogous way that God is doing this in the world right now? Because the gospel, I'll say it this way. The gospel is alive and well today, just as it was in New Testament times, in 6th century BC. God is at work in the world. We don't always see it. So this is a time where the preacher gets to venture a guess, and sometimes that's what it is, a guess at where God is actually working in the world now, and where we can see that and believe that that is the case, right? So God is healing, releasing. God is lifting the bent over to be to see and to walk straight in the world. God is giving us another chance. How do we sort of say this now in a contemporary context? Well, you can, again, Paul Wilson's very helpful here on pages 3 and 4, especially on page 4. What does the gospel look like? He gives you some clues, some places to look for that. So one of them is, what is God doing in your church right now? Sometimes a sermon doesn't have to sort of name all the things that we need to do now. What a sermon does is it names what we are already doing. And not that we should feel proud or great or whatever, but to say, you know what, in our own way, we are bringing the gospel to this community with our soup kitchen, with the things that we do for each other, whatever. If that's the only thing we always say is that the church is the channel through which God is working, that's a problem. We want to keep mixing this up. Where is God working in the world? Paul Wilson is a kind of a conservative Christian, actually. But he's not conservative in this sense, in that he sees God working in the world in people that aren't religious, or people that aren't Christian, or people that are Buddhist or Muslim or whatever, right? He tells stories about great things that are happening. Sometimes these stories are from the radio, sometimes from TV, sometimes they're from novels. These are stories about amazing things that people are doing to help other people in an analogous way to how Jesus was helping somebody else. They don't have to be Christians. This emphasis that Mennonites and Methodists and so many other Protestants and Catholics are talking about these days, the emphasis on being a missional church and being a missional people, this really challenges us to do exactly the same thing. We don't always invent the missions that God is doing in the world. God is doing a lot of things in the church, and God is doing a lot of things outside of the church. And one of the things that Christians can do is simply witness what God is doing in the church, in the world. And the church can look at that and go, whoa, we want to join that. We want to join what those folks are doing in our community, who may or may not be Christians or religious or whatever, but God seems to be doing something. God is we see the good news here, and we want to join that. And part of joining that would be telling that story. So I think that's another sort of avenue for seeing the good news in the world. I want to just highlight this. There's a great tendency we have in pages 3 and 4 to reduce the gospel, to change the gospel into something else, to take it away from what God is doing in the world. So I want to entreat you to look at page 161, and for the next few pages, Wilson writes about typical problems in preaching grace. Number 1, for instance, preachers identify God's action in a sentence or paragraph and then shift the focus back to human tasks, as though we are afraid to continue to talk about what God is doing in the world, right? Or preachers confuse imperatives with grace. This happens in, we need to recognize, or we should, that kind of thing. Watch the imperatives. We're still talking about what God is doing in the text and in the world. And in point 3 down here on page 162, preachers confuse non-action verbs with grace. Statements such as God is present, God hears, God cares are good, are as far as they go, but they're not much better than Bette Midler's song, From a Distance God is Watching Us. We need to be more concrete. Verbs, active verbs, have a lot more power than God is present or something like that. God is no mere spectator, onlooker, or voyeur. God cares to get really involved in human life, in touch, and in all kinds of visceral ways and embodied ways. And so, for goodness sakes, we have at the core of our gospel is the story of a dead guy who comes alive again. That should be just a little bit scary, and more than a God who is somehow at a distance and disinterested and saving us from a distance. No, God is tangible and real. And what kind of verbs can we use for that? And again, going back sometimes to the text to find those verbs or something like that could be quite helpful. Now, here's a classic little conundrum for the end of your sermon. So you've done page 3 successfully, and you've worked on page 4. You've told us a story of how God is working in the world in an analogous way in your community or whatever. And then there's a temptation to do something at the end. It's a temptation to either apply this to life as though you haven't been applying it throughout the whole sermon. The 4-page sermon has us applying the gospel, the trouble in the gospel throughout. You don't have to add a little something at the end. There's a temptation at the very end to say, and now we should, and this calls us as people of the gospel to do the following things. No. Keep it just for this time. You can do whatever you want after this, but let's experiment with keeping it in the good news. staying at a place where we end up by saying not something like, and we need to invite more people to church. Something like, God is inviting us to this banquet. And then sit down, right? God is healing us. I mean, of course, this line that you're using is loaded with everything you've said before. I invite you to try that. And there's some scientific evidence on this, folks. Again, I've probably referred to this study before, but this study was done some years ago on the people who listen to sermons and who love them in a number of different denominations in the U.S., including Mennonites. And, you know, the folks who are listening to us are on to us. They know when they've heard the gospel. They know when they've heard the good news. They know because they're going, oh. Or sometimes it's not as dramatic as that. Sometimes it's, right? But they've heard the gospel. And then the preacher just keeps going. Because the preacher feels like they have to preach a longer sermon, or because the preacher feels like they have to sum it all up, or the preacher feels like they have to apply the whole thing again. Yeah. One of the things I'm doing with my sermons and with other people's sermons, students, is if I don't give them this little sermonette I'm giving you right now, is to, once you've written your sermon, take off the last two sentences, or the last two paragraphs sometimes, unless you're really thinking about it beforehand. But sometimes those last two paragraphs, or especially the last paragraph, you're trying to sum it up. Rather than trying to sum it up, just give us the gospel. Speak to us. Proclaim to us the gospel. You may even want to dare to say something like, God says, I love you. You are my children. Or God says to us, this is my challenge for you. I love you. I need you to be my servant. Now that gets a little bit more disciple-y, I understand, but and put something on us. That's fine, but it's still God. You're taking the risk of God, of you speaking for God, who is addressing us in love and giving grace to us in that moment. So that last little part the last 4 minutes may have been somewhat unclear, but what I'm tempting you to do, what I'm daring you to do, is to end your sermon before you think you have to end it. End your sermon in a place of God's unmerited, beautiful grace, because boy, do we ever need it.